airplanes have always cost a pretty penny, but some fetch prices that'll make your jaw hit the floor. From a Texas beloved Spitfire to the jet bought by the king himself, here are the most expensive vintage planes that'll leave you wide-eyed and wallet-shy. 1940 Supermarine Spitfire P9374. If we're talking about vintage airplanes that were sold at high figures, it would be a crime not to mention the Spitfire. Once buried beneath the sands of Calais, the 1940 Supermarine Spitfire Mark I with serial number P9374 somehow rose from the dead straight into the history books. And to be honest, it makes sense because it wasn't just any vintage aircraft. It was a bona fide Battle of Britain warrior that was piloted by Flying Officer Peter Cazenove when he was just 21 years old. Now, many planes in World War II had insane stories, but the P9374 stands out as one of the most iconic, going down in dramatic fashion during a dogfight in 1940. That on its own is crazy, but for this Spitfire it was only the beginning. You see, during the dogfight, Officer Cazenove crash-landed on a beach, survived, and then got captured by the Germans. His plane, on the other hand, was swallowed by the tide and forgotten until 1980, when it was somehow rediscovered like a time capsule, perfectly sealed by Mother Nature. What followed this insane rediscovery was a $3 million restoration that turned the salt-crusted wreck into a sky-ready stunner. When we say the plane was brought back to life, we absolutely mean it. I mean, the work done was complete with period-accurate controls, a gleaming Merlin engine, and the kind of swagger only a 92nd Squadron Spitfire could pull off. So, with so much going on into resurrecting one of Britain's finest, what happens next? Well, in 2011, the Spitfire took to the skies again, and to put it simply, it was glorious. It wasn't just metal in motion, it was a memory flying. It was a rebirth of the past, a reminder of what it meant to roar for Britain. And as if that wasn't enough, this blast from the past fetched a jaw-dropping $4.8 million at a Christie's auction in London on July 9, 2015. Okay, restoration money aside, why the wild price tag? Well, the Spitfire wasn't just a rare piece of flying metal in legend. It was real, it was active in history, and it was practically what legends were made of. It survived war and came back to life, and for one lucky and, let's face it, loaded collector, it became the symbol of courage and amazing craftsmanship. Speaking of collectors, whoever bought the next plane is probably one of the coolest people alive today, because that plane was Elvis Presley's 1962 Lockheed. While some people are known for owning famous objects or artifacts, this airplane was made famous for who owned it. Let me explain. Everybody knows Elvis Presley, and if you don't, then you're definitely missing out. The man was a legend, a rock star, and as you would expect, a big spender. In 1962, Lockheed launched a sleek bird called the Jetstar, a four-engine business jet used by VIPs and the military. To be fair, this aircraft saw moderate success as it was the first dedicated business jet. But the moment it met Elvis Presley, this iconic aircraft wasn't just any corporate jet anymore. It was something new, something cultural, something that fetched an eye-watering sum in just a few years. Bought by the king in 1976, this four-engine beauty was a skybound palace, infamous for its red velvet seats, gold-plated fixtures, and that iconic TCB lightning bolt. Honestly, this whole jet was a nod to Elvis' personal mantra, taking care of business, and to be fair, when you look at how he customized this jet, you would agree he took care of business. Sadly, the time Elvis spent with his jet was short, as the king died on August 16, 1977, just about a year after purchasing the beauty. Although the time was short, this jet was still seen as nothing less than signature Presley. Bold, stylish, and unforgettable. At least that was until we all collectively forgot about it. Sure, it sounds strange to forget a whole jet, and not just any jet, a jet owned by the king. But that's exactly what happened. Following Elvis's death, the aircraft glory took a nosedive. And for over 35 years, it sat alone, sun-bleached and gutted on a dusty Roswell runway. This luxury plane suddenly had no engines, no luxury, just rust, silence, and a story waiting to be retold. And thankfully it was. At an auction in 2017, this grounded relic was put up, and although it was initially estimated to be worth about $2 million due to its state, it later sold for $430,000 purely on star power. Now, it might seem weird to buy a jet without an engine, but the buyer didn't just get an aircraft, they got a time capsule, a tangible slice of Presley's high-flying past. But somehow this wasn't the end of the story, because even when it sold for $430,000 in 2017, in what I can only call an insane twist, the buyer never actually laid eyes on it. Year after year it sat, sun-blasted, wind-battered, frozen in time. Then, finally, in 2023, on what would have been Elvis's 88th birthday, someone finally gave it a new life. YouTuber James Webb, aka Jimmy's World, snagged it at auction for $260,000. Not because it could fly again, it couldn't. In fact, restoration to flight status was a multi-million-dollar fantasy, but rather to turn the abandoned aircraft into something no one expected, a road-legal RV. Yep, Elvis's last jet is now a rolling piece of Americana called the Elvis-mobile. It's not airborne, but it's alive, and after 40 years in exile, that's one hell of a comeback. Now, if you think the Elvis collectors are insane, wait till you hear about the man with $15 million Spitfire collection. Okay, this one would make anyone foam at the mouth with jealousy. Meet Wilson Connie Edwards, aka the Spitfire King, a Texas oilman, stunt pilot, and vintage aircraft collector. Edward didn't just collect vintage airplanes, he was actually the very man who flew Spitfires in the 1969 film Battle of Britain. With that said, buckle up because here's where it gets crazy. Instead of getting paid cash for his role in the film, like any other actor, Edwards was paid with actual World War II warbirds used in the film. Yep, he was paid in actual vintage warplanes, including icons like an actual combat-proven Supermarine Spitfire Mark IX and a Hawker Hurricane. Okay, so what did he do with them? Well, at first these aircraft sat quietly on his Texas ranch for decades, but not in the rust of disuse, but quite the opposite. These planes were lovingly maintained, rarely flown, and as you would expect, dripping with history. And when Edwards finally decided to sell, all his love and care paid off as the Platinum Fighter sales brokered the transaction with a British collector. In 2014, the final price was quoted to be, brace yourself, north of $15 million. This wasn't just a purchase, it was literally a transfer of generational wealth. The jaw-dropping $15 million deal sent shockwaves through the vintage aviation world. And rightly so, because once again, these were the actual warplanes. You have to understand that the Spitfire was a war hero. It had fought with the RAF's 92nd Squadron during the Battle of Britain, while the Hurricane and several P-51 Mustangs added Allied firepower to the lineup. But here's the thing, if Edward was such a vintage plane lover, why would he sell his collection? Well, Edwards had initially planned to pass the Spitfire to his son, but sadly, he was left with no choice but to let it go after his son sadly passed on. The plane had become more than just a relic, it was a legacy too sacred to keep grounded, and a reminder of what could have been. The sale was legendary, a one-man air force that was built from a barter deal, preserved in the dry Texas air and eventually flown home across the Atlantic. It was a story that combined history, Hollywood, heartbreak, and horsepower. So much so that today Edwards' collection is one of the most fascinating collector stories in aviation lore. 1929 de Havilland Gypsy Moth. Famous all on her own, the 1929 de Havilland Gypsy Moth is a plane so charming it just had to make this list. I mean, you could claim this plane flew straight out of a storybook and no one would argue with you. If you were a thrill seeker or a sky dreamer in the 1920s and 30s, this delightful two-seat biplane was the definition of a dream come true. Loved for its affordability, reliability, and sheer elegance, this thing ruled the air. But wait, we just called it affordable. Why is it on this list? Well, one Gypsy Moth in particular that was built in 1929 and later named Gammy, a nod to legendary aviator Amy Johnson, became a global star in the Oscar-winning film Out of Africa. Yes, if you remember that golden yellow beauty soaring over the savannah with Robert Redford at the controls, that's her. That movie was more than 90 years ago, and guess what? She's still flying today. Beyond the Hollywood glam, the Gypsy Moth helped make flight accessible to everyone. With its folding wings for garage-like storage and a cruising speed of about 85 miles per hour, it was the Model T of the skies for Britain's flying clubs. Sure, it's no Spitfire, but this bird has got class, charm, and a film credit most planes would kill for. So, as you'd expect in 2024, this very aircraft was sold at RM Sotheby's for $140,000, with the full proceeds donated to supporting a rhino sanctuary in Kenya. Which is just poetic, seeing as Out of Africa pushed her to stardom. Today, the Gammy stands as a rare mix of aviation history, cinematic magic, and environmental goodwill. It's not just an aeroplane, it's a legacy wrapped in linen and dreams. Now, speaking of really old planes we all loved, next up we have the 1943 Beechcraft Staggerwing. Okay, make sure you're strapped in because what you're about to witness wasn't just an auction, it was a runway revival. Our star of the moment, the 1943 Beechcraft D-17S Staggerwing, wasn't just another World War II plane. Oh no, it was a high-flying gem that made waves in the vintage aviation world. This bird wasn't your average antique, it was a flying masterpiece covered in wartime legacy and executive luxury. A biplane ballerina with the heart of a bomber escort and the soul of a sky king. This icon was nicknamed the Gentleman's Fighter and was once the Rolls-Royce of the clouds. With its negative staggered wings, retractable landing gear, and a 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine. It didn't just turn heads, it twisted necks and turned wallets, and well, just look at it. Perhaps one of the most famous of these planes was the infamous N79484. At more than 80 years old, she was no hangar queen, she was a force to be reckoned with. And with a fresh restoration, barely 37 hours on the engine, and $200,000 in upgrades, this beauty was suddenly more airworthy than most weekend flyers. Once she was open to the public, collectors circled like hawks. There were even whispers that she could fetch anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000. At the moment, she's listed for a whopping $335,000, but only time will tell how much she will sell for. And there you have it, from sunken Spitfires to velvet-lined jetliners and oil tycoons paid in warbirds. These vintage planes didn't just change hands, they changed history. Whether they flew through battle, rocked through stardom, or rolled down a Texas runway, each one came with a price tag and a jaw-dropping backstory to match. If this airborne auction ride lit your afterburners, hit subscribe and ring that bell. We've got more sky-high legends, forgotten hangars, and million-dollar wings coming your way. Keep your goggles on, your landing gear locked, and whatever you do, don't underestimate a dusty old plane. Catch you in the skies.